Well, look, I've got close roots in Minnesota. My grandfather was in the Minnesota legislature, where Jen was also in the legislature. He was a DFLer back in the 1940s and 50s. And but when I was growing up, we used to come to Minnesota every year. This was like our wholesome family vacation, and we would come and always beg to stay longer and longer because you guys have it all going on here. And we would even come up in these parts to some of these lakes. I don't know which of the 10,000 lakes we went to, but we would come up and we would go fishing. I've got some just magnificent memories of it all, and I still have relatives who live not here, but down in the Twin Cities area. So I love Minnesota, and I got to say, I was thinking about Thomas Jefferson, because we spent back when I was a professor, we spent a year living abroad, and we were in France, and we had a tour guide who showed us all the places Thomas Jefferson used to go, and she told us that when Jefferson would toast the people of France, he would say, and I want to toast France because everybody on earth who loves freedom has two countries, his or her own, in France. And I was thinking that in America, everybody who loves democracy has two states, his or her own, in Minnesota. Humphrey and Walter Mondale and the Democratic Farm Labor Party. So I feel very close to all of you guys here. But America has become a deeply polarized country, at least in terms of our daily political discourse. And I'm convinced that a lot of the polarization and division are really just there for the sake of political polarization and division. If one side says X, the other side has to say anti-X, and the dynamics of political division and polarization on the internet and on the websites and so on deepen this problem, but they may actually be masking a lot of common ground and common sense that still exists within the people of the country. And I should also say that I suspect, with a lot of evidence, I think, but I suspect that there are foreign strategic actors like Vladimir Putin and Cambridge Analytica and Steve Bannon that have done everything in their power to inject racial, ethnic, religious, ideological poison into the American bloodstream through the internet to try to drive Americans apart. So I think that we have an obligation to try to recover the common ground and the common sense that our country was born with. Common Sense was, of course, the great pamphlet that Tom Paine wrote when he came over to America. He arrived 2 years before the Revolution in 1774. He fell in love with the promise of America. Fell in love with the idea that there could be a nation not governed by kings and queens and royals and lords and nobles, but by the people. Just the people in the vast blue sky in Tom Paine's image. That's what America could be. He said that America would become an asylum to humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you, okay? An asylum to humanity if we lived up to the values and the ideals of the country. And so he wrote Common Sense, in 1776 as a way to unify the country, and it became the organizing document of our revolution. And by common sense, he meant the sense that everybody has. You didn't need a theology degree or a PhD from a fancy school in England or anything. It was the sense that everybody had, and common sense meant the sense that we have in common if we're willing to reason together, And of course, our founders like Paine and Jefferson and Ben Franklin were champions of the Enlightenment, the idea that we could converse in public based on reason, based on logic, based on facts, based on empirical investigation. And we didn't need superstition and conspiracy theory and mythology. The facts were enough for us to govern and to make progress together. So, I was a professor of constitutional law for 25 years before I went to Congress, and so this might be something of a professional hazard, but I do believe that not only does common ground exist in the country, and common sense still exists in the country, but the Constitution itself contains the core of principles that we need in order to resolve what seem like the intractable problems of our time. We can use the Constitution and its meaning to recover and to rebuild common ground and common sense in America. So I thought I would take here in northern Minnesota what is usually thought to be the most polarizing, the most divisive, and the most provocative issue in the country, gun violence and gun rights and gun safety, and demonstrate, or at least try to demonstrate, that we're actually not that divided at all, and that a proper understanding of the Constitution will help us transcend the seeming division and polarization that locks us in a paralysis on the problem. Now, most people, I think, regardless of where they think they are on the gun issue, would concur with where the conservative Supreme Court majority ended up in Heller versus District of Columbia in 2008. Now, in this decision, the claim was being made for the very first time that the Second Amendment guarantees the individual the right to own and possess a gun completely detached from service in the militia. And if we can start the PowerPoint and go to the Second Amendment. So this is the text of the Second Amendment: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the survival of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, up until the Heller decision in 2008, the court had always taken the position, and the academic scholarship was on the side of the idea that the meaning of the Second Amendment was that people only possess the right to a gun if they're in the militia, which today we would call the National Guard. In other words, if you're ready to be mobilized. Okay, so that was the traditional position, which was challenged over a period of decades. And in 2008, in this challenge to the District of Columbia's handgun control law, the Supreme Court overturned that position in a controversial decision, 5-4, and said, no, the Second Amendment actually does give all individuals the right to gun ownership for two purposes. And one is a handgun for the purposes of self-defense. And two is for the possession of a rifle for hunting and recreation. Now, the liberals on the court disagreed with that and wanted to adhere to the older understanding that the meaning of the Second Amendment is defined by its so-called prefatory clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state. Okay, they said that it was tethered to militia service, and the court rejected that, and there's still some people who believe that, but I would say that where the court ended up was actually where most Americans are, whether as a matter of constitutional law or as a matter of public policy, that people have a right to a handgun for self-defense, and people have a right to rifle for whatever hunting and recreational purposes they want to have. Now, if you go to the next slide, Justice Scalia, who wrote the opinion, was also extremely clear that the Second Amendment right, like every other right contained in the Bill of Rights, is conditioned upon reasonable regulation in service of common interests, public safety, and public security. So he said, let's see, go to the next one if you would. Let's see, maybe that one got omitted, but in any event, what he said was that But of course, this right, like all other rights contained in the Bill of Rights, is conditioned upon public safety and public security and the regulations that are adopted there. And specifically, he said, background checks were okay, restrictions on carrying guns into sensitive public places, city halls, public schools, and so on. But he made it clear that although the right exists, it's always got to be existing in the context of the neighborhood of public interest principles. And of course, in the context of the First Amendment, we understand the same thing. You have a First Amendment right to speak, but you don't have a First Amendment right to get your bullhorn or your megaphone in front of the White House at 2 o'clock in the morning when people are sleeping inside. The Supreme Court has always said that the basic rights we have are subject to reasonable time, place, manner restrictions in order to enhance public security and public safety. So I'm willing to venture the thesis that even the people who belong to the gun safety organizations accept this basic understanding that people in America, and again, still makes us somewhat of an outlier, but people in America are entitled to defend themselves with a handgun and also to have a rifle. Now, also, regardless of your politics or where you think you position yourself in the great gun safety debate, I think that the vast majority of Americans, if not all Americans, agree that the current situation is absolutely intolerable in terms of the bloodshed and the gun violence that we see on a daily basis in America. We have rates of gun homicide and gun violence that are 25 times higher than other comparable nations in the world, like Canada, Germany, UK, all the European nations, Israel, Japan, you name it. Nothing comes close to America in terms of the levels of gun violence and gun homicide that we experience. We lose more than 100 people every single day to gun violence. Most in one-on-one gun violence situations, but increasing numbers, an increasingly large share in massacres, in mass shootings, which the experts define as 4 people or more being shot. So we now have on average more than 1 mass shooting every single day. Last year it was close to 2 mass shootings every day. Most of them you never hear of, but they're part of that same chain of massacre and catastrophe that includes Columbine in Colorado, Sandy Hook Elementary School, in Connecticut, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School massacre, in Florida, the Pulse nightclub shootings in Orlando, the Virginia Tech massacre, which took the lives of dozens of college students, Sutherland Springs, Aurora, Colorado, the Uvalde, Texas elementary school massacre, the Mother Emanuel Church massacre of praying parishioners in Charleston, South Carolina, the Walmart massacre of dozens of people in El Paso, Texas, the Buffalo supermarket killings by a white supremacist, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, more parishioners killed there at a synagogue, the Las Vegas mass shooting, which took the lives of 60 people, and so on and on. I mean, we could spend hours just reading the names of the massacres and days more reading the names of the victims. Now, there's in fact pervasive agreement in the country about what needs to be done about this bloodbath that we're in. More than 90% of Americans, the vast majority of Democrats, the vast majority of Republicans, the vast majority of independents agree that there must be a universal violent criminal background check on all gun sales in America. Everybody pretty much agrees to that. 87% of Americans who do not belong to the NRA agree with that. 70% of American gun owners who do belong to the NRA agree with that there needs to be a background check to make sure that violent felons, that fugitives from the law, undocumented people, and others who should not be getting guns don't get them. And yet we have these loopholes in the law that people can purchase guns without going through a background check at private gun shows, in one-to-one private gun sales, and on the internet. And if we close those loopholes, we would save a lot of people's lives. That's how a lot of those guns are getting into the hands of criminals and into the criminal underground. Similarly, we have vast support. 75% of gun owners, 80% of non-gun owners supporting the red flag laws, the extreme risk protection orders, where families or police officers who believe that someone is presenting a danger to himself or herself or to other people can go to court and to get a civil protection order in order to prevent gun violence or massacre. And again, the majority of Americans favor a ban, restoring the ban that we used to have on the sale of AR-15s, which is the choice assault weapon in massacres, and other weapons of mass destruction, other military-style assault weapons. And of course, the AR-15 and assault weapons are not used by hunters in hunting, and they're not used for self-defense. So they do not fall within what the Supreme Court said were the core purposes of allowing individuals to have guns detached from actual militia service. Okay, so what I'm willing to venture is that even the people who see themselves as the most concerned about gun violence and the most liberal in terms of wanting to regulate it in the interests of public safety, accept that people have a right to rifles and to hunt and to engage in lawful recreation, and also to defend themselves with a handgun in the home, which is what the court said in the Heller decision, and also that the vast majority of people consider themselves very strong pro-gun rights people, also recognize that the current situation of mass bloodshed and random gun violence is intolerable and unacceptable, and something needs to be done, and we can do these things without actually impairing what the underlying constitutional right is that people have. All right, now, the problem is that the National Rifle Association and some of the politicians who follow it closely say that the actual meaning of the First Amendment, of the Second Amendment rather, the actual meaning of the Second Amendment is to empower the people to overthrow the government. Okay, this is NRA dogma. The actual purpose of the Second Amendment, they say, is to give the people the power to overthrow the government if it turns tyrannical. So here's one of my colleagues, Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida, who says the Second Amendment, quote, is about maintaining within the citizenry the ability to maintain an armed rebellion against the government if this becomes necessary. Here's my colleague Lauren Boebert from Colorado. The Second Amendment is our protection against a tyrannical government. Quote, it has nothing to do with hunting unless you're talking about hunting tyrants. Maybe. Here's my colleague Chip Roy, my friend and my colleague Chip Roy from Texas, who says, the Second Amendment is designed purposefully to empower the people to be able to resist the force of tyranny used against them, which means, of course, you can't regulate the AR-15s and assault weapons, or indeed tanks, or what have you, because the people have to have an arsenal equal to that possessed by the government. Now, it so happens that there are more than 400 million firearms in America today. Certainly the people have a lot more firearms than the Army has, or the Navy, the other armed forces. But the claim is essentially that the people who are, in fact, the militia, must have an arsenal equal to the firepower of the US government in order to be able to overthrow the government if the government becomes tyrannical. All right, and this is the central claim of the people who oppose, effectively, in Congress, every effort we make to pass a universal violent criminal background check supported by more than 90% of the people, or the other measures that are supported by the vast majority of the American people, the red flag laws, the ban on military-style assault weapons as objects for sale in civilian commerce, and so on. Now, this is the claim that I want to look at today, and I want everybody to think about, because this is a clear constitutional claim that's being made about what the Second Amendment will allow or not allow, and I want us to take it seriously. I try to take it very seriously and debate with my colleagues about it all the time, because if they're right, then of course there's nothing that we could do short of amending the Constitution. And in fact, they will often get up and they say, Raskin wants you to repeal the Second Amendment. And I say, no, I don't want you to repeal the Second Amendment. I want you to read the Second Amendment, okay? We don't need to repeal the Second Amendment. But if they're wrong about their claim that the Second Amendment gives you the right to take up arms against the government, well then, in that case, we can proceed to enact reasonable gun safety reforms that are supported by the vast majority of the American people. So let's look at the claim, okay? Before we do a doctrinal analysis of it, let me just start with this, because insurrection, as you know, has been in the news recently, and we've had more than 1,000 prosecutions and indictments of people for engaging in insurrection. We've had dozens of people convicted of seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government, people who pled guilty to seditious conspiracy. And do you know how many of the indictments have been quashed, or prosecutions have been nullified, or convictions have been overturned because there's a constitutional right located in the Second Amendment to overthrow the government? None of them, 0, have been quashed on that basis. So that should at least get you thinking, have the courts missed something? Have all these defense lawyers actually missed something about the insurrectionary thesis of our Constitution, that the Second Amendment gives us the right to overthrow the government? Another kind of prefatory point we could make is it's kind of what the Civil War was about, wasn't it? I mean, do you have the right to overthrow the government? And Lincoln said, no. He said, in fact, insurrection is an attack on what Lincoln said was the first principle of democratic government, which is the right of the people to choose their own leaders. So if we've chosen our own leaders, and then someone says, we don't like your leaders, we don't like your process, we don't like your election, we're going to depose the whole system with a violent insurrection, that's not an exercise of constitutional rights, that's an attack on the constitutional order and the right of the people to govern ourselves and to choose our own leaders. But let's look at it. I'm not even going to ask anybody to read any Supreme Court decisions. I'm going to ask you only to engage in the strenuous act of reading the Constitution itself, okay? And so I've assembled, I hope this is good. Let's go to the next one. Okay, yeah, let's start there. Okay, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. And this is Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates the powers of Congress. Well, one of the powers of Congress is to call forth the militias from the states in order to repel foreign invasions and to suppress insurrections. Now that's interesting, isn't it? On the one hand, the claim is being made that the Second Amendment, which doesn't mention insurrections and doesn't mention rebellions and doesn't mention revolutionary violence against the government, gives you the right to engage in insurrection, but here, in actual written language, Congress has the power to summon the militias that are sometimes characterized as potential sources of revolutionary popular violence against the government to put down insurrections. And where does that come from? Well, you guys remember Shays' Rebellion in the 1780s? You remember this? Some people actually remember it, it sounds like. Shays' Rebellion triggered a federal response and a state response to put down the rebellion, and the founders were absolutely adamant that nobody has the right to engage in extra-legal, extra-constitutional means to overthrow the government, okay? Let's go to the next one. Here's the Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4, Section 4. U.S. shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government and shall protect them against invasion and against domestic violence. Okay? So Congress has a responsibility to protect a Republican form of government. And by the way, that doesn't mean a Republican Party form of government. It means a representative form of government. And to protect the states against foreign attack and against domestic violence from within. Now, is it possible that the Second Amendment in invisible ink gives you the right to engage in domestic violence against your government, against the police, against the leaders, but at the same time, the Constitution gives people the guarantee that Congress will intervene to stop a violent attack on their governments? That seems very unlikely to me. Let's go to the next one. Here's the treason clause of the Constitution. Well, treason consists in levying war against the Union, against the government, or adhering to their enemies. So is it possible you've got a right to wage war on your government, but it's also treason? And remember, they're trying to torture out of the Second Amendment the idea that you've got a right to attack the government, but the treason clause is the only place in the entire Constitution where a crime is defined. It's the most significant extreme crime, the crime of attacking the government, right? I found 5 other places in the Constitution. Go to the next one. I can't remember what I put up there next. Oh, this is my favorite one, okay? Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says, you've been elected to office. You've sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. But if you've engaged in insurrection or rebellion, you may never hold federal or state office again in the United States. Now, is it possible that the Second Amendment, again, which doesn't mention insurrection or rebellion in any explicit terms at all, gives you a right to overthrow your own government, and yet it's a crime considered so treasonable and so extreme that if you engage in it as a president or a representative or a senator or so on, you can never hold office again? That seems fantastical to me. That just seems impossible that that's the meaning of our Constitution. So I could keep going, but I think you get the idea that our Constitution is an anti-insurrectionary Constitution. And when I pointed out to my colleagues across the aisle, and I just read them chapter and verse what the Constitution says, some of them will leave the room, but when I get a substantive response, it comes in 2 varieties. One is, well, what about Patrick Henry? Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. which, yes, was a great 18th century bumper sticker, I suppose, by a Virginian anti-federalist who voted against the Constitution. Okay, so he opposed the Constitution precisely because he thought it centralized power too much in the government. And so he didn't want to have anything to do with it. He voted against it. It would be like if we were trying to interpret the meaning of the 13th Amendment or the 14th Amendment, and we asked what Jefferson Davis thought about it, right? If we asked for a Confederate interpretation of the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War, that just doesn't make any sense. So then their argument, and this one has a lot more surface plausibility, is, well, what about the American Revolution itself? What about the Declaration of Independence? We rebelled against royal tyranny. We engaged in a revolution against those who would violate our rights. And that is 100% true and accurate. But if you read the Declaration of Independence, which I urge you to do, Thomas Jefferson never once appealed to the Magna Carta or the British Constitution or British law. He appealed to natural law and natural right. He said that we appealed with a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, that we are being tyrannized by a long train of abuses and usurpations by the British Crown. And that's why he said we will pledge to each other our fortunes and our sacred destinies together, because he understood that we were stepping outside of the realm of British constitutional law, and he knew that the people doing that were putting their lives at risk. And he said that they were willing to do it by appealing to natural law and natural right. So, but Abraham Lincoln was very clear, because he went right back to that point during the Civil War, and Lincoln said, you either have a right to change the governmental structure through the constitutional means, including by amending the Constitution, going through Article 4, getting a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate, getting 3/4 of the state to agree, or by changing law through the state legislatures or federal law, or, he said, you have a right to step outside the whole constitutional structure and take your chances with an attack on the whole constitutional regime. But he said it would be absurd if the Constitution gave people the right to destroy the Constitution. And no, we do not have the only Constitution on earth which gives the people the power to destroy the Constitution. If you think, for example, that the 2020 presidential election, instead of being the safest and most secure election in presidential history, according to President Trump's own Department of Homeland Security, if you think that, in fact, over the evidence of 60 federal and state courts rejecting every claim of electoral fraud and corruption, if you still think that that election is an exercise in tyranny, well, then, by all means, you have a right to come, a natural right to come and attack our police officers and bloody them and put them in the hospital and storm the Capitol and try to overthrow an election which Joe Biden won by 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. But if you fail in that enterprise of revolutionary violence, we will arrest you, we will prosecute you under our laws with the presumption of innocence and due process, and if you're convicted, like Stuart Rhodes, the Yale Law School graduate who was head of the Oath Keepers, you will go to jail for many years in the United States of America for attacking our rights. All of which is to say that we're living in a time of insurrectionary thinking and insurrectionary politics. It's not the first time in American history. I don't want people to get too freaked out about it. They're not the first people who thought they could overthrow the government of the United States. They're not the first people who thought that they would appoint themselves dictator and in charge over the will of the people. That's not the first time that that's happened. But when we talk about gun violence, this insurrectionary theory of the Second Amendment is contributing to a lot of unnecessary death and bloodshed. It is wrong. Under the Second Amendment, we can pass a universal violent criminal background check. We can pass the red flag laws, and we can ban military-style assault weapons, and we can protect everybody's right to have a handgun for self-defense if they feel they need it, and to carry a rifle for purposes of hunting and recreation. We can get through this. We can make this happen in America. We can recover the common sense that our forebears bequeathed to us. We can recover the common ground that is our birthright as Americans. And so I thank you for giving me the chance to share some thoughts with you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.